is what are the main lessons to be learned from these practices and experiences? That's the first question. The second one is, what are the constraints, the limitation of this African governance practice to reimagining democracy? And the third question is, what are the major policy implications for both Africa and for the rest of the world and globally? So that is the three questions.
Thank you, Mwalimu.
So the floor is yours. The honor is yours.
Merci Ali. Donc voilà, les trois grandes questions. Ben, on va commencer dans l'ordre.
Okay, we'll try to take them in.
On commence de façon un peu paradoxale. Par exemple, quelqu'un qui a envie de nous dire pourquoi est-ce que, par exemple, le recours à l'endogène serait, par exemple, malvenu. Comme ça nous permettrait de voir le plus grand, les cas qu'on peut avoir entre ceux qui pensaient avoir, disons, la solution, une des solutions, que ce n'est vraiment pas une solution. Qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait avoir déjà comme argument
division between
dire
those who think that endogenous is the way forward and those who believe that we should stick to a topical sort of modern organization mode without reverting to more traditional or questioning that system, basically? Okay.
And that's when you can sharing. It's okay to say I can only do this so that I can actually bear fruit rather than take.
Okay, Mshai, you have the. Are you talking? No.
Can I suggest Marcel to facilitate the debate? I think we the person who want to intervene just have to click on the hand lift, and then you can see on your screen on the left of your screen, if I understood, those who have raised their hand, and we give the floor like that. So before Shai, I think there was yes, who wanted to intervene, and then followed by Misha. And
okay.
Okay, can I move on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you. For me, it will be a general comment, mais je pense que je vais parler en français. C'est un.
I will swap to French. I think this is more a general comment, in fact, that I wanted to make pertaining to Mrs. Telekesi's communication, if I pronounce her name properly. Basically, going back to the Gachacha's experience, when just to make sure we agree on the goals of this last round of table. Basically, we're aiming at those three goals, which are the lessons and experiences, and then the limits and the third. Yes, sorry, I was just giving ourselves a little hindsight, stemming from Mrs. Alice's expose on Gachacha, which can be parallel to the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation that was set up in South Africa, that also had to be confronting itself basically the same fundamental existential question of adopting a more or less endogenous system. And it found itself quite useful in times of crisis. It seems to be working. But according to me, my theory is actually that we're kind of in a permanent crisis. And even though it is not politically correct to say so, everyone at the end of the day knows themselves, and we all speak the same language. And so we were able to turn to a good remedy. And in South Africa, I suppose it was the same instrument that came about as the most powerful and efficient one, thanks to these common grounds and factors about having the same language. And that's why I listened carefully to what she suggested or said about the judges, members of the Gachacha. She insisted and emphasized clearly on the fact that they were not professional judges, and yet it worked really well. So the question is, how can we, as much as possible, integrate this at least in our educational system? Say in the faculty of law in today's Rwanda, how do we deal with this sort of situation? Because that was an exceptional situation that resorted to a very operational, traditional tool that turned out to be efficient. And how could we make something preventive and more permanent out of it, basically? I hope my question was sufficiently clearly formulated. Yeah, because I believe you Purek's observation can be extended to many other fields of observation. In our observation of the contrast between endogenous and modern aspects, for example, in this management of the sanitary crisis, endogenous solutions definitely came back to the forefront as well, because there were alternative medications suggested, compensating for the polemical new synthesized one. So I know that endogenous tends to be a plan B, perhaps a second best, or an alternative that one resorts to only when there's nothing else or nothing left. So I think Elise is definitely raising a finger and would like to bounce on what's been said. Yes, that's what I'm saying. So how do we turn endogenous sources and factors basically from shift crisis reactive ones to kind of permanent ones? Okay, at least, as you know, we opted for an order of speech. Normally, Mshai had expressed a desire, I think, to take the floor. If we abide by Ali's suggestion, we'll go back to you immediately. Okay, right. Thank you for making an exception then. I'll be as quick as possible to react then. It's true that endogenous is a classical tool in times of crisis, but in Rwanda, we didn't leave it at that. I didn't have enough time to be exhaustive on this chapter, but first of all, we extracted from the Gacaca. The Gacaca took place in the first stage, but then there was another institution, a Bornsey, which was set up later on in a more sustainable, permanent form. So it means literally those who reconcile the members of society. So this is a legal function, and it foresees that in every neighborhood, some people have been appointed conciliators or reconciliators, basically, so that we can avoid clogging the judicial system. That is one important or interesting factor that stemmed from the Gacaca in Rwanda. The second thing beyond Gacaca to be known is that there are several more endogenous practices which have been integrated in the Rwandan governance system. Let me give you one example. That of l'imihigo, what we called imihigo, which had to do with high performance events. Basically, there were administrative contracts based on ancient traditions and facts. So before the administrative year, even us at university, for example, as we're a public university, we have to make a pledge of what we think we're going to be projecting ourselves in the coming year. And in June, you have to do what we call buligula. That's a sort of self-assessment as well of what you have achieved in comparison to what you had pledged to do. And there's also something we call mushikirano. In December in Rwanda, the president of the republic meets the different representatives of the diaspora, sort of significant members of the diaspora who can then bring to the table major issues that they had to come to grips with during the previous tax years. And then in March, there's this other endogenous practice called Muyugerero. And that is a practice during which all leaders together and try to assess together as best as they can how to correct and redress the previously identified problems in order to get down poverty. So I'll limit myself to these few examples, but it's just to say that the answer to your question is beyond crisis and pure crisis times. A lot of these endogenous factors have now really been integrated into the governance system, and I'm really calling upon a prolongation or an extension of that practice, if you like. So thank you very much, Elise, because I believe you just showed an element which was maybe too implicit, the fact that not only can the endogenous factors integrate themselves into some new political institutions, but it definitely happens to have a place or a role to play in the educational system and also in the academic research environment. And I suppose all of my colleagues, including Ali, were about to touch upon that subject. So even though we're discussing mainly the political dimension, the academic and pedagogical ones matter too. No, Chai was next, I believe, or someone else. Yes, Martial. By the time Misha reacts, I don't know if she's... Okay, I'll switch language.
Take note of the idea. So a first idea and lesson learned is that indigenous governance respond to the situation of crisis as now, but also, and Ibrahima showed yesterday, these systems themselves have been a response to a situation of local crisis. Okay, so that they respond to the situation of crisis and they show their efficiency, and also that we have no other thing to do. I mean, the failure of the dominant model anyway is there, even in the countries in which they were created. So why we are going to copy or to follow something that is not working where they have been created? So then because of the failure of the dominant model, and because of the crisis that we have confronted with, we have to use, and this is, I think, a lesson that we can say we have learned from this different presentation. And I think, but here, just for the discussion, we have to think about also another lesson I see, but need to be discussed, this concern of the consensus building and reaching a kind of unanimity in the decision making. That is something I think is also common and which is important, and to include all the different voices. I think that is something that and a third one, and then I led the discussion. Will be the framework.
Say something.
Yeah, would be the philosophical, ethical framework on spiritual framework on which any system should be based, respecting and rooted in the cultural specificity of the society.
Okay, Professor Hall, are you okay with the idea that if the dominant model fails, then automatically the ancient model will work? I'm doing it purposely, you know. I'm doing it purposely.
No, of course not.
It's a rhetorical question.
No, I really think that we have to avoid dichotomic thinking, in the sense that human nature is a network. If we look at ancient DNA, we look at genomics and all of things, people are moving all over the place all the time. So our culture, our kind of instinct in the evolution of humanity. So the dichotomy between endogenous and non-endogenous is a kind of artificial construct. We tend to understand what it means. It means what local people used to do compared to what non-local people brought. It is well understood, but culture is always a construction. It is a give and take constantly. And I do think that the problem we have is that we have been in a situation of imposed adoption of alien system, because we were weakened and we were weak. And so what we're trying to do is now to bring back the cultural background of our ancestors, our older people, in the mainstream of organization of our society. But we don't have to frame it in dichotomic terms. We have to pick what works and make it us, make it ours, and build with all the examples we can take from all over the place. Africa first, and then maybe take something non-African if we can do it. So my comment is simply that we tend to understand what we mean, but we don't have to be a prisoner of dichotomic thinking, local, non-local, and things like that. We have to be processualists, I would say, because we localize the alien and so on and so forth, and we keep moving forward, building something we wish to do.
Yes, Professor, and I'm sure someone will argue about what you said and what my coming question. All the solutions come with the time. They come with the time, and they come with the culture, in the sense that culture is a response, and when it's a good response for people, it becomes their, it becomes their way of thinking, their way of doing, and sometimes it becomes so solid and so somehow hard to change, but it's also help people to live. And so my question is, that's why I asked the question on how people are chosen. What is the place of the imaginaries in those solutions? That's why I asked the question of all the spiritual background that I just didn't clearly see, even in when we talk about in the Congos, with the Maroons, etc., etc. And what is the spiritual ground of that? I see that Larissa would like to answer.
Yeah, before going to Larissa, just give me 1 second. Okay?
Yes.
No, because I'm really the bad person to address that question, because I don't even know what my culture is anymore.
Yeah.
I claim to be African, but my life experience have been out of Africa for so long. I've been out there for 45 years. And if you ask me if I'm US, French, Senegalese, Cameroonian, Bassa, I don't know anymore.
Chinese.
So I have to build an Africanity for myself. And that's the process I'm trying to convey to you, that I'm building my Africanities based on picking pieces from different African experiences to have the honor to be African, because I'm not sure I'm African anymore. Please, Larissa, it's up to you.
Je suis très contente avec les dernières paroles ici.
I'm very happy actually with the last formulation or suggestion. So I don't want to repeat what Augustin has just said, but it echoes very well also, I think, the concerns of some of the members of the audience in the chat. It's to figure out what Africa we're talking about, because everyone's got their own pieces contributing to the gross and overall puzzle of Mother Africa's identity. And I do agree that to a certain extent, sort of simplistically categorizing the local culture as endogenous or exogenous is not enough, because it all depends on the cultural luggage that comes and package that comes with it, basically. Whether the culture has been imposed from outside, from third parties against the community's wills or interests in, or not, basically. All of this goes to say, whether we talk about the Quilombos or the Comalis or other communities when we're looking for solutions in order to make up social refs, say, after the genocide in Rwanda and so on. All of this comes down to adopting a governance system that is stemming probably from a down-to-earth local situation, applying or sufficiently operational to be hoisted to the national level. But at the end of the day, it's really the process analysis which will maybe make it sustainable or make us decide that this is a lasting, efficient solution when it's a working one, and when at the outcome of a series of fluid adjustment process, people sort of stick to a solid option. Because what happens, at least in Brazil, when I observe what's going on, there's a lot of trial and error, a lot of experimentation on the field until some working system presents us with an alternative governance system. But in the beginning, we fiddle around basically with whatever current structure exists, with traditional items we have available, depending on what territories we're looking at. But at the end of the day, people had to be opportunistic, and they do to this day keep a relationship to their former colonies, of course, and entertain some trading relationships, and need to make sure they're not isolating themselves from the previous existing system. So for the Quilombos today, for example, and other ethnies probably, there has to be a middle ground or a compromise between living with one times and surfing on the global culture, and on the other hand, respecting your local cultures. So, as Alice said, we take a model, but not in a formal way, until we decide it's formal, basically. Because there are so many parameters and questions coming into play until you actually solidify this process, that it's hard to put your finger on a universal conclusion, basically. It's an ongoing sliding process. Thank you, Larissa. Is that what you're all saying? Is that the peace judge is somehow necessity. It's a necessity that brings people to make virtue. Just like in Colombo, for example, we heard a lot. Somebody's opened their microphone unwittingly, apparently.
On nous disait avant, les Quilombos étaient séparés, complètement isolés du monde.
Told that the Quilombos were completely isolated from the rest of the world, and now we learned that they were not that isolated, as you rightly sort of stressed, because they kept selling their merchandises to their former colonies, and therefore indirectly took part in the slavery economic system. So the judge piece, after all, has to make allowance for the necessity. And once we admit or acknowledge that beyond survival aspects, we know that things keep changing and evolving. But is there, do you think, a specific universal concept about society in general, perhaps, or human beings that can be derived from these trends to fit all systems and institutions? Because that's a legitimate question to ask ourselves. Otherwise, of course, anything goes. If there is no guidelines in order to conceive of mankind, everything's allowed, is it? Or am I asking for too much by asking such existential questions, Ali?
Yeah.
Non, c'était pourquoi je dis ça. Je dis ça parce que les leçons qu'on va tirer. Là, on a dit.
And discussions, and you are indeed broadening our horizons. Sorry if I'm confusing everyone. It's true that our last question basically was putting or asking about the existence of potentially of a divide between the endogenous and exogenous factors or governance systems, whether that only apply to crisis situations or beyond. And what we came to realize was that apart from the elite's choice, matrilinear, alternating, more or less flexible and rigid systems were adumbrated in front of us, unquoted. Out of this whole list of interesting diversity, is there anything we can retain as a universal trait, or can we just should we just stick to diversity?
I think that the debate, of course, yes, we will give you the floor.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Go ahead.
I will react on the upper chief, and this at the Maroons, the upper chief had earthly and spiritual power. For example, the Juka chief, upper chief, is also the head priest of the Shweli. The Shweli, that's the spiritual guide of the tribe. And the upper chief, the Gama, is the one who consults the Shweli when the tribe has to take an important development. For example, multinational will come because some places had spiritual entities that you can go there and do things like the religion is an important part of the community.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Martina. So you see, you speak much more English than you.
No, I try.
Yes.
If I have the time to think, because I think in Dutch, but if I have the time to think, then I can manage it.
OK.
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 Donc, on retient que dans toute la diversité de l'endogène, on ne peut pas rejeter les autres dimensions, les dimensions immatérielles, les dimensions spirituelles, les dimensions qui sont aussi les dimensions qui organisent les sociétés contemporaines et anciennes, mais de façon différente. Et ça veut dire que même déjà en Europe, si vous prenez le concept de laïcité en France ou en Angleterre, il n'est pas vécu de la même façon. Donc, on peut aussi comprendre que dans les formes de gouvernance nord-européennes ou africaines, on laisse aussi ouverte cette diversité pour pouvoir interpréter les institutions comme étant soit partiellement divines, soit en tout cas inspirées par des valeurs qui ne sont pas des valeurs matérielles.
Inspired by values which are not necessarily material. Do you all agree with this?
Eureka.
Oui, ok. Bon, ça me conviendrait. Ça me convient même parfaitement.
And I also would like to say that I don't see in everything that is endogenous and in all our presentations today and yesterday, I don't want it to be people pulling up bridges. There are practices in endogenous systems which are open. For example, someone talked about the Normandy Charter. We talked also about the Bachata. And there are also other experiences in the African diaspora. So my hypothesis is that this could create a true universalism based on humanity and not something that was brought upon us, that was imposed upon us, and which is a joke because this system made us wonder, made us ask ourselves whether we were human beings. And there is nothing of this kind in endogenous governance. And one lesson that I could draw is that it can apply to anyone, to all human beings. So maybe we should move forward in this direction in order to reshuffle humanism, in order to be human beings in a humane world, not to subjugate others, but to foster humanity. And the purpose is to oppose a system which goes against human beings. Professor Hall talked about the world, but look at the world. Look at the American continent. Almost all human beings in America have been subjugated. Even the natives have been submitted, and we don't have this in our ancestral governance system. We are seeking freedom there, but this is a joke. How could they succeed to reverse the rhetoric? So I think that we should focus on our local governance system in order to foster humanity. Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Ibrahim Ibn Diai, and then we'll hear the Professor Hall. Although what I'd like to say is that it is relevant to reshuffle humanism, universalism, and endogenous systems would allow us to create a true humanism. Yes, it seems. But we can see that endogenous system would lead to pluralism. And now, before giving the floor to Ibrahim, I would say that when you look at the Vendée Charter, we have a charter which talks about human beings, but also about all living beings. And now I'd like to give the floor to Ibrahim. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my two brothers because you have summarized everything that I wanted to say. Because yes, indeed, if I had to draw one lesson of these two amazing sessions, and which goes in the same direction of our research, it's this aspect, because yesterday I said that we have theorized the theory of life versus the theory of death, and the theory of community versus the theory of individualism. And this is what inspires me. This is what makes me really happy when I listen to you. Because that's what I think of when I look at Africa as a whole, the African continent and the African diaspora, because we are putting an emphasis on women, on youth, the elderly community as full-blown members of the living world. And I think that this is obvious. We cannot put this into question. When we think of climate change, of protecting the environment, we all realize that we have destroyed too much for vested interests. So we need to change the world. And for once, we have the answers, and we shouldn't have a complex or. And I would like to give you an example of the CDAO, ECOWAS in English. We see that there are all forms of solidarity in all populations, because we are all brothers. We are all the same people, the same human beings. And since the dawn of time, we have worked alongside one another. And this goes back to what we were saying of human beings who need to go beyond boundaries. So the lesson we need to learn is that we need to reaffirm on behalf of the whole of Africa that we need to focus on humanity. Secondly, what I would like to say is that I was particularly stricken by what we learn from each other in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Suriname. I know that we have constraints, but there is a strong dynamic. We see that we need to promote Pan-Africanism. I don't really know how, but I rely on my brother, Ali, in order to develop this. And then in terms of policies for Africa and for the world, please apologize. I am a universalist, but I'd like to think first of my continent. So we need to find the means in order to prepare Africa spiritually, not necessarily economically or socially, but we need to focus on spiritualism. We need to understand that we are complex beings, biologically, physically, and we need to have a holistic approach. We shouldn't focus on food and then health and then education. Everything needs to happen as a whole, and this approach, this holistic approach, needs to come from us, from African scholars. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ibrahima. Ibrahim Iba Ndiaye wants a holistic approach of endogenous knowledge. He wants to focus on spirituality, to say that when we focus on endogenous systems, we don't want to focus on specific dimensions. And in the end, governance systems need to think of all dimensions. So the bottom line is that we are trying to reject domination. We also see that some dominant systems no longer works environmentally, economically, and so on and so forth. And we see that endogenous systems can inspire the world and can give more impetus to the world. Augustin, Professor Hall, over to you. Well, I'd like to focus and to go back to what Ibrahima said. I'd like to quote his sentence. We don't know, we are unaware of ourselves. We don't know ourselves. And we need to work on resuscitation, or on renaissance. And let me give you a very tangible example. Local African practices were stigmatized during the colonial period. Many were suppressed, but they haven't disappeared. And maybe we should recruit, maybe what I'm working with China is to create a program in Cameroon and to recruit a doctor specialized in the ancestral Chinese medicine in order to forget about the medicine that was imposed upon us by France. So we need to look into the Chinese experience because China has two different medical systems. They are not opposed to one another. And we can use this experience in order to create an African health system, which is both traditional and modern, so that it goes in line with the Western health system, which we need, in fact. So the question is related to our Renaissance. Opposing endogenous and non-endogenous is not relevant because we need to build on existing foundations, but we need to reinvigorate practices which were put aside because of the subjugation of colonizers. And this is why I wanted to talk about dichotomy and the fact that I am opposed to this dichotomy. We need to reaffirm our endogenous system, for example, in health, by focusing on our traditional medicine. Thank you very much, Professor Hall. Maybe this allows us to further highlight constraints, because when you talk about endogenous systems, you know that the African countries which used African solutions during COVID couldn't do this because they wanted to work with the WHO, and I have seen that in Cameroon, in order to recognize a product which was used by everyone in families, we needed to label it as a food supplement because we didn't want to compete with the WHO system. So we see that we are encountering constraints, and this is why endogenous systems don't have a space to express itself. For example, if we were to have a charter of endogenous systems, they might say that we are signatories of such and such conventions. What do you think about it? Well, the first article is that any life is a life. And in Article A, it says, inaudible, and I trust the system more than the Declaration of 1789. Bear in mind that the system in France was defending the men over women. And this is why the declaration focuses on the white men not even white women. I think that we are going to draw to a close. But what I wanted to talk about were the constraints, because we can have external constraints. Ali raised his hand as well as Ibrahim. Well, what I wanted to add is that I am part of a committee, and we have a project to draft the new constitution of Mali, and that is exactly what we wanted to do. This is a very good thing to know.